Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Sheviis chapter 5, Halacha 2. This is part 2 of the shir. Now, yesterday we were covering this issue about what happens if you have loof, which is leek, and you go ahead, you plant it, or it's there, and it's, somehow it's an aftergrowth, and it just like a seed was trampled into the ground, and it grew in the 7th year. Now it's the 8th year, and you have new leaves that grew in the 8th year, and you have leaves that grew in the 7th year, and you want to go pick it. Is it going to be a case where you have to do an accounting, separate out the 7th year leaves, give those to the poor, and collect the 8th year leaves for yourself? Or is it a case where the poor had the ability to go collect it, the time has passed, and now you're effectively reclaiming it? Effectively, it has the status of Beur, which means that it's past the time when it normally grows in the field. And basically what it is where, it's hefker, and you come along in the 8th year and you're collecting the 7th and 8th year leaves. So there was a Gemara yesterday by a Brisa by Bar Kapara, and the question about this is going to be with regardings to Bar Kapara. Is it going to be a case where this Mishnah is going to be written before the decree of the time of Sefachim being declared as D'Rabbanan and being instituted? The rabbis instituted Sefachim because they didn't want cheaters to come and sprinkle a bunch of seeds into the field and pat it down and then claim, oh, it grew in the 7th year. Oh, look, it's okay to me. And they didn't want to have cheaters, so they precluded all the Sefachim. But the question is if this is going to be Sefachim, then perhaps the 7th year leaves are going to be forbidden, not only in the 7th year, but also the 8th year. So in this Bar Kapara Baraisa, it's going to be interesting because the question is going to be, in this Baraisa, does this apply not only to loof but to other vegetables as well, like onions? And Bar Kapara effectively is saying in this Baraisa that no, it's not going to count for that. It's going to just count for loof. And the idea is you can have it where the loof, these leeks, will grow over multiple years. And it can be a case where the leeks will be planted in the 6th year, it'll grow in the 7th year, and then you can pick it in the 8th year, and it never had any Sheviis sanctity at all, except for some leaves. If you have some leaves that grew in the 7th year, and they were new leaves, then those would have sanctity, but the plant itself would not. The bulb itself would not have sanctity. Now, we're going to get into a really interesting note about trying to learn Gemara in general. And I'm going to look at what the Chazan Ish says. The Chazan Ish says that the Gemara in Chulin 141a and b says that any Baraisa that is not taught in the academies of Rabbi Chia or Rabbi Oshaya are prone to be erroneous. And therefore, Bar Kapara's Baraisa cannot be used to figure out what's going on with this. In other words, you can't refute Rabbi Yirmiyah and what's going on with regards to this Mishnah, because it might not be reliable. And the note by the Rosh is that although the Baraisa of Bar Kapara is quoted by Rabbi Hoshaya, who is the same person as Rabbi Oshaya, it is not one of the Baraisas that is Academy authenticated. So, therefore, we can't use it. Now, this is an important tool because if you're seeing a Baraisa and it's not one that one of these two academies used, then you can't rely on it for the halacha. Now, the Gemara is going to draw an inference from Rabbi Yirmiya's explanation. And the Gemara goes like this. Rabbi Yirmiya's statement that the Mishnah is dealing with wild loof tells us that something that is subject to Beur, that is found within and growing from something that is not subject to Beur, is subject to Beur. Now again, this is dealing with the leaves. So Rabbi Yirmiya is saying that in this Mishnah, that we're dealing with wild loof, and I checked in Kalayim in chapter 1, Halacha 2 yesterday, and there's a difference between wild loof and regular loof. In other words, that they're not subject to Kalayim, so it's not like a different species, but there is a difference in it. So it's like a different variety, shall we say. But again, they're not different enough that it would be Kalayim with one another. So effectively, you have a dispute with Rabbi Lazer and Rabbi Yeshua, and the issue is going to be about these leaves that grow, and it looks like with what Rabbi Yeshua is saying that these leaves are going to be subject to Beur. And we can learn from Rabbi Yirmiya's explanation that something that is subject to Beur, that's growing from something that is not subject to Beur, is still subject to Beur. So, if you had these wild 6-year loof, and it entered into the 7th year, and there's going to be some 6th year leaves and the bulb, and you decide not to pick it. Then you have a case where it's the 7th year, it sprouts new leaves, and then these can last for many years, and it goes into the 8th year. Now you have a situation where you have some 7th year leaves, some 8th year leaves, and some 6th year leaves. Okay? So the issue can be, well, this bulb clearly does not have Sheviis sanctity. The bulb, you can pick it because it's really 6th year produce. Now, the interesting issue is going to be that, hey, this 7th year leaf grew from a 6th year bulb. And what this is trying to say is that, yes, the bulb is not subject to Beur, but this new thing that grew out of the bulb, this new thing that grew out in the 7th year, these new leaves, which are edible and great for soup stocks, and this is going to be subject to Sheviis sanctity. And so this part of the leaf will be subject to Beur. Now, the Gemara is going to ask about this and say, what does Rabbi Yirmiya do with this inference? In other words, that logic here looks like something that grows from something that is not obligated in Beur, is not obligated in Beur. So that needs a little bit of clarification. In other words, you have this dispute. And the question is, why does the Gemara deduce this from Rabbi Yirmiya's explanation? And, the Mishnah is stating that the bulb of the wild loof is not subject to Beur, but the leaves are subject to Beur. And this seems very strange because it would look like something that is subject to Beur that grows from something that is not subject to Beur is still subject to Beur. And the answer goes like this, okay? The answer is that on this Mishnah, there's no deduction that can be made. And it could be that in the case of this Mishnah where something is detached, the leaves from the bulb, and, they detach these leaves during Sheviis, by the time the Beur arrives in the 8th year, the leaves are no longer connected to the bulb. And in that case, it gets very obvious that the leaves are going to be subject to Beur. But this other case with Rabbi Yirmiya is going to be where he's explaining this Mishnah where the leaves are still on the bulb in the 8th year. And so then the case is that you had new leaves that grew in the 7th year and new leaves that grew in the 8th year. And Rabbi Yerushalmi is trying to explain that something that is subject to the Beur, that is attached to something that is not subject to Beur, when the Beur time arrives, is subject to Beur. So Rabbi Yerushalmi is holding the case that the bulb is not subject to Beur, but grew these leaves that are subject to Beur, and it went into the 8th year. The leaves are still subject to Beur because they grew new in the 7th year. So they're trying to figure out if you're gonna be looking at wild loof, which can be growing in the 6th year, which definitely has no sanctity at all, and then leaves that are part of this bulb do not are they going to have sanctity when they come up in the 7th year or not, coming out of a bulb that has no sanctity? So the Gemara is going to answer, and he explains that the cases where he pulls the leaves off from the bulb in the 8th year before the time of Beur comes. So the Mishnah is talking about a case where the leaves are still on the bulb in the 8th year. And Yerushalmi is trying to explain that if after the loof has added new leaves in the 8th year, and then you detach the leaves before the time of Beur arrives, there's no proof that can be brought that something is subject to Beur that's attached to something that's not subject to Beur, and when the time of Beur arrives, it's going to be subject to Beur. So let's try to pull this all together and try to come up with this. So here's what Rabbi Yerushalmi is saying. Okay, we have a dispute in the Mishnah between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. Okay, and the Mishnah's argument goes like this. It says you have loof. It begins growing in the 6th year. Okay, the loof is not subject to sefachim because that bulb has no sanctity. It grew in the 6th year. It didn't grow in the 7th year. And in the end of the 7th year, you have new leaves that grew on this loof in the 7th year. And then it gets pulled out of the ground. And so since the loof is picked in the 7th year, that's going to be subject to Beur. And if it's then left lying in the field and it takes root again, and new leaves grow in the 8th year, that's what they're talking about. So you have this dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua if the owner has to come along and take an accounting to the poor. And the leaves are then going to be detached from the bulb in the 8th year before the time of Beur arrives. So the idea is going to be, again, is something that's subject to Beur, that's attached to something that is not subject to Beur, going to be subject to Beur? Okay? So the question is, on this non-Sheviis bulb, you have new leaves that grew on Sheviis. What's going to be the status of these new leaves? Because you could say, why should the leaves have any Sheviis sanctity at all? Because it came out of a bulb that has no Sheviis sanctity. And so there's going to be another way to try to figure out what's going on with this argument between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. Okay, so far we've been talking about this dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, and trying to look at this other dispute in a Mishnah in the 9th chapter in Sheviis between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. And Rabbi Eliezer is holding, like Rabbi Yehuda, that only the poor can come acquire produce that is declared at the time of Beur, and Rabbi Yeshua is holding like Rabbi Yossi, who says that anybody can acquire it. This argument is going to be a little bit different than the dispute between Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai on the status of Hefker. Bet Shammai argues that if you make a declaration that only the poor can collect Hefker, or say something like Hefker is only for the poor, then it's a valid statement of Hefker. And Bet Hillel says it's not a valid statement of Hefker, and it's not hefker at all, you actually didn't leave hefker, because hefker has to be for everyone. This is a little bit different because we're talking about sefachim, and sefachim is derabanan, and we're talking about the status of hefker. Hefker is a deraita thing. You're allowed to leave hefker. So it's a little bit different, but the idea is the same. This is not a case of one taking the position of Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai here, because again, they're dealing with something that's derabanan. So the Mishnah goes like this. Rabbi Yosef interprets the Mishnah in chapter 9 to refer to a loof that was planted before Rosh Hashanah of Sheviis. So that's going to be that it's planted in the 6th year. And the Gemara continues and says, he planted it before Rosh Hashanah of Sheviis in the 6th year, and he produced growths before Sheviis. So, in other words, began growing in the 6th year. And the idea is that this is not going to be covered under sefachim because it grew in the 6th year. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, he then crushed the leaves in the 7th year to prevent any further growth by treading on them while they were still attached to the ground. And nevertheless, the loof continued to add its growth, and he subsequently uprooted it totally in the year following Sheviis. That's going to be the 8th year. So in other words, he's actually trying to make sure that, he's crushing the leaves. And, the idea is going to be that really if you're crushing the leaves, it's really like uprooting it. And it's really as if you picked it in the 7th year because you've crushed the leaves to stop any further growth. So we know that, loof is going to be a vegetable. And regarding vegetables, the date where you pick it is going to determine the status. And therefore, if you did this to the loof, it would be subject to Beur because you've effectively picked it, and you've effectively made it where you've put it into the 7th year because you've effectively picked it. Okay, that's what it's arguing. So the idea is that the loof comes and it adds growth after you've done this. And then he comes and he picks it in the 8th year. What's going to be the issue? And Rabbi Yosef is going to explore this, and he's going to say, if you say that crushing is like uprooting, it all goes to the poor. In other words, everything that grew until the time of the crushing belongs to the poor, because it's like you picked a vegetable in the 7th year. That's effectively what he's arguing. He's saying that if you're going to say crushing is legally deemed to be uprooting, then it's like you picked this vegetable like any other vegetable in the 7th year, and then that has Shemitah sanctity now. Why? Because the majority of the water that sustains it came from the 7th year. So the Gemara is going to continue, is going to say, if you say that crushing is not like uprooting, and therefore it is not considered as if the loof were picked in the 7th year, but rather in the 8th year, then all of it does not go to the poor. In other words, the poor have no claim on any portion of the leaves, even those that grew in the 7th year. So the idea is going to be that, because you have loof, and if this is the case where it's not going to be considered to have been picked in the 7th year by crushing the leaves, but actually when you take the bulb out of the ground in the 8th year, then the vegetables are going to follow the year it's picked. So if you had these 7th year leaves that grew in the 7th year, and you've picked it in the 8th year, then all of it's going to carry the law of vegetables, which means that the year you pick it is the year where it is. So that would mean that it's an 8th year produce, and even the 7th year leaves are going to be an 8th year produce because it's a vegetable. It's when you picked it. So, the idea is that the leaves would belong to the owner because it's like he just picked a vegetable in the 8th year. And this is going to conclude, it's going to say, out of doubt, because Rabbi Lazer was in doubt whether crushing is like uprooting or it's not like uprooting, he was stringent and ruled that the owner must make an accounting to the poor. And Rabbi Yeshua, on the other hand, maintained that crushing is definitely not like uprooting, and he rules that all the leaves go to the owner. In other words, the poor have no accounting of them. So the argument goes like this. It says, If crushing is not like uprooting, then the loof was first picked in the 8th year, and therefore it's not subject to Beur, and whatever leaves were not picked in the Sheviis year belong to the owner and have no Sheviis sanctity. That's going to be the idea, because effectively you've picked the whole bulb in the 8th year. Now, Rabbi Kanievsky in his Beur is going to suggest a different way to interpret this, and he's going to say like this about this Gemara. He says that if crushing is going to be like uprooting, then any leaves that grew after the crushing are not deemed to have grown from the ground, but rather from the uprooted loof itself. And since the loof was crushed on Sheviis, if we say that crushing is like uprooting, then all of the leaves, even those that grow that on the 8th year, after the crushing would belong to the poor. And since they came from the loof itself, it's going to belong to the poor. In other words, if you're going to crush the leaves, and that's as if it's picked, and it's as if you're picking it, and new leaves somehow emerge out of this plant anyway, and then you've come and you picked the bulb in the 8th year, Rabbi Kanievsky is saying that effectively you turn this bulb that was planted in the 6th year into 7th year produce, and basically now this, because crushing is like uprooting, they're saying, and the leaves that grew are also going to be 7th year produce. So if that's going to be the case, then all of it, even the bulb, has to go to the poor. So in that case, the Gemara is saying that Rabbi Lazer is holding that uprooting is definitely like crushing. And in that case, he's saying that the loof itself, if it's going to be picked, is going to it's all going to belong to the poor. But that's very strange, because why would Rabbi Lazer rule that some of the leaves can go to the owner? So the Gemara is suggesting, says Rabbi Kanievsky, that Rabbi Lazer was in doubt as to whether the crushing is like uprooting, in which case all of the leaves would belong to the poor, or crushing is not like uprooting, in which case all the leaves would belong to the owner. So he's compromising and ruling that crushing is uprooting insofar as that the leaves that grew in Sheviis, but not uprooted insofar as the leaves that grew in the 8th year. And that's why the owner has to come and make an accounting of the poor, according to the interpretation of Rabbi Kanievsky. Now, there's going to be another dispute, another way to try to interpret this dispute between Rabbi Lazer and Rabbi Yeshua in this Mishnah. And the Gemara is going to go like this. So we're really trying to figure out what's going on with this odd thing of the loof that could be, grown in the 6th year, and it can carry over into the 8th year, and it can grow new leaves over 3 years. So Rabbi Hiskia interprets the Mishnah as referring to loof that's planted on the eve of Rosh Hashanah of Sheviis. That's going to be in the 6th year. And he planted it on the eve of Rosh Hashanah of Sheviis, and it produced a growth in the 6th year. So it's very clear that this is not going to be subject to Sefachim, because this came and grew in the 6th year. It's planted in the 6th year, grew in the 6th year. It's the 6th year. Now, the idea says like this. It says in this Gemara, he crushes the leaves in the 6th year to prevent any new growth. And then what happens is the loof continues to grow, and it adds growth anyway. And he subsequently uproots loof totally at the end of Sheviis, in other words, in the 8th year. He comes and uproots it. And now the question's going to be, when he uprooted it, when he crushed the leaves in the 6th year, okay, that should look like it makes it, the bulb is situated and the leaves are situated, and the whole thing, it looks like if it's picked, it was done in the 6th year. He leaves it in the ground, and what happens? New leaves come and emerge in the 7th year. Now he picks the bulb in the 8th year, and you have these 7th year leaves. What do you do with them? That's going to be a question. So, this is going to be another kind of case And the question is going to be, is this what the argument between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua are talking about in the Mishnah? And so Rabbi Hiskia is saying like this. It says, if you say that crushing is like uprooting, it all goes to the owner. And if you say crushing is not like uprooting, all of it does not go to the owner. In other words, if crushing is not like uprooting, then the owner basically would have no claim on any of the leaves, even those that grow in the 6th year. And the Gemara says that because Rabbi Eliezer was in doubt whether crushing is like uprooting, he compromised and said that the owner must make an accounting to the poor. So the Mara Fulda says about this that in regards to the leaves that grew in the 6th year, Rabbi Eliezer said that crushing is like uprooting, and then those leaves would belong to the owner. And in regards to the leaves that grew in the 7th year, he said that crushing is not like uprooting, and therefore those leaves would belong to the poor. But Rabbi Yeshua is holding that the crushing is definitely like uprooting. And so that if the leaf were to be picked in the 6th year, then all of the leaves would belong to the owner, and the poor would have no accounting. Well, but that's basically what Rabbi Yeshua is saying. So Rabbi Hiskia is agreeing with Rabbi Yossi in this dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua about whether crushing is going to be like uprooting. And the issue is going to be that, if you have a case where you have non-Sheviis leaves, which would belong to the owner, according to Rabbi Eliezer, that grew in the 8th year or in the 6th year, and then the question is going to be, with Rabbi Eliezer issue, why do you have to make an accounting? And the idea is that, if crushing is like uprooting, and you're going to go by like Rabbi Eliezer interpretation, there shouldn't be any accounting to the poor at all, because if crushing is like uprooting, then everything should belong to the owner in the 6th year. So why do you need to make an accounting if you're going to go by Rabbi Eliezer opinion? And what's odd about it is that if you were to say that crushing is not like uprooting, then everything should go to the poor anyway, because, but what's interesting here is that Rabbi Eliezer turns out to be in doubt whether crushing is like uprooting or not. And so he's compromising and awarding 6th year leaves to the owner and 7th year leaves to the poor. So this is kind of what's happening here. Now, according to Rabbi Eliezer, the owner must make an accounting to the poor, and that's what's so odd about this. And the Gemara is now going to try to explain how do you make this accounting, because it's going to be weird. Like, how do you determine which part would have grown in Sheviis, which part was before Sheviis, which part came in the 8th year? So that's what's so interesting now. So Gemara says, if the loof endured in the ground 3 years besides the year of Sheviis, so it's 6th year, 7th year, 8th year, the owner gives the poor 1/4 of the leaves. And if the loof endured in the ground 2 years besides the year of Sheviis, the owner gives the poor 1/3 of the leaves. And if it endured 1 year besides the year of Sheviis, the owner gives the poor 1/2 of the leaves. So in other words, if you've left it in the 7th year and 8th year, you would give half the leaves, because you would say, well, half grew in the 8th year and half grew in the 7th year. And if this were in the ground for year 5, year 6, year 7, and year 8, so that's the first part of it. It's saying the loof endured in the ground 3 years besides the year of Sheviis. So year 5, year 6, year 7, year 8, you're going to give 1/4 of the leaves, because you're going to say 1/4 happened in the Sheviis year. And if you're going to say that it was planted in the 6th year, grew in the 7th year, and then the 8th year was picked, you'd say 1/3 of the leaves grew in the 6th year, 1/3 of the leaves grew in the 7th year, and 1/3 of the leaves grew in the 8th year, and that's how you do the accounting. So the Gemara is going to cite the opinion of Rabbi Yosa and Rabbi Hiskia, and it's going to say like this. So Gemara says, Rabbi Yosa interprets the Mishnah as referring to loof that was planted before Rosh Hashanah, the Sheviis. It's crushed during Sheviis. And Rabbi Hiskia is interpreting the Mishnah as referring to luf that was planted on the eve of Rosh Hashanah Sheviis and also crushed on the eve of Rosh Hashanah in the 6th year. So it's planted, it took root, it grew, and it's going to be crushed so that you're only trying to get the bulb to be bigger and you're not trying to worry about leaves or these halachic issues about splitting up the leaves and finding the pore and things like that. You're crushing it so that this will go over the Sheviis year and you'll end up with a nice big leek bulb in the 8th year without these complicated leaves. That's going to be the idea. So we have these two interpretations of the Mishnah. Is it referring to luf that's planted before the Rosh Hashanah and then you're crushing the leaves in Sheviis, or is it going to be like how Rabbi Hiskia is saying it and interpreting this Mishnah, that you plant it in the 6th year, you crush it in the 6th year, and then you picked it in the 8th year, and then leaves happen to have grown in the 7th year in both cases. And this is talking about luf, could be talking about luf of the year before Sheviis. So both Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Hiskia do agree that the dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua revolves around whether crushing is like uprooting. That there's no disagreement about. In other words, if you did crushing, is it uprooting? Is it not uprooting? So the Gemara says that Rabbi Bun Barhia asked in the presence of Rabbi Zera, how could Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Hiskia explain the dispute of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua hinging on whether crushing is like uprooting? Because if that were true, even in regard to the years of the Sheviis cycle, it should be where if it were like the other years of the Sheviis cycle, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua should disagree regarding the other years as well. So like if you have a disagreement between Meiser Ani and Meiser Sheni in year 3, year 4, if you're going to say crushing is like uprooting, then it should also be over there for Meiser Ani, Meiser Sheni, but you're not finding that there. So basically, that's a really killer point, because Rabbi Bun is proving that in fact Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua do not disagree on the other years of the Sheviis cycle. So it's taught in Brisa that if it was the 2nd year of the Sheviis cycle entering the 3rd year, he may not crush the onion nor withhold from it water in the 2nd year. And in order that it be classified as a product of the 2nd year and be subject to Meiser Sheni and not the Meiser Ani of the next year. And if it was the 3rd year of the Sheviis cycle going into the 4th year, he may crush the onion and he may withhold from it water for the 3rd year in order that it be classified as produce of the 3rd year and subject to Meiser Ani and not subject to Meiser Sheni. So this, by the way, would result in a loss of Meiser Sheni, but he may do so since the poor are going to gain. So the proof goes like this by Rabbi Bun. He says that this brisa tells us that crushing is indeed like uprooting according to everyone. In other words, the fact that this brisa is saying that onions are going to be assigned according to the year that they're crushed and does not mention that this point is disputed, it tells us that everyone must agree that crushing is like uprooting. So what does this mean over here? It must mean that regarding this dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, it's not going to be as Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Hiskia is explaining, in other words, whether crushing is going to be like uprooting, but it's going to be whether only the poor can eat the produce after the Beur, or whether the Beur is going to be available to everyone. And so that's really what the argument's about. In other words, that this is not a Mishnah talking about is crushing like uprooting. In fact, what they're trying to say is there's no disagreement about that. What they're trying to say is that's not what the Mishnah is saying. He's basically saying that if that were the case, Then over here with onions, about whether you're going to do it for Meiser Shini, Meiser Ani in either the second and third year or the third and fourth year, there's no dispute. So over there, there's no dispute, and you're doing crushing over there, and there's no dispute. So it can't be talking about that. In other words, that it must be that everybody agrees that that crushing is like uprooting, and that it's not talking about whether crushing is like uprooting. Really, what it must be talking about is that these loof weren't crushed at all, and they actually grew these new growths. And the question is going to be an argument about when it enters into the 8th year, who's collecting it? Is it going to be subject to where only the poor can come and collect this produce and eat it? Or can it be claimed by the rich? In other words, the rich person's harvesting it, he's effectively claiming it. So the Mishnah is going to state that loof of the year before Sheviis, which enters the 7th year and is still attached to the ground, and so too with these kitzonim onions that are talked about in the Mishnah. And then the matter in fertile soil. Matter is this red dye. It's going to be used for red dye. So the idea is going to be that you have to use special spades of wood according to Bet Shammai to uproot it. And Bet Hillel says that you can even use a mattocks of metal. So the Gemara is going to qualify this, and Rabbi Yosef says in the name of Rabbi La, explain the Mishnah is referring to where he uprooted them before they sprouted leaves. In other words, that once they sprout leaves, these leaves would also be forbidden, and so then you'd be forbidden to uproot them because you'd be destroying the leaves. And so the leaves would wilt, and you would create a form of wasting. So the idea is that because you're not allowed to let these leaves get wasted, you can't waste and destroy Sheviis produce, and you're not allowed to pick produce of Sheviis before it reaches a stage where it's edible, and produce that's picked before it can be eaten is also going to be a problem, because that can also be a form of wasting, because it would have become, it already sprouted, it would have become good. So the Mishnah states that about kitzonim onions, and the Gemara is going to ask what are kitzonim onions, and it says it means summer ones. In other words, kitzonim onions are going to be a form of onion that's planted in the early summer, and it's going to be picked at the end of summer. That's the note by the Rosh. And the Gemara is going to continue, and the Mishnah states, and Bet Shammai admits to Bet Hillel in regard to matter of tzilos, one may uproot them even with mattocks of metal. So Bet Shammai is saying that you cannot uproot matter growing in fertile soil with a metal tool, but if you were doing it in this rocky soil, that's what tzilos means, you can even use a metal tool to do it, because it does not look like planting and plowing, because these rocky terrains, like what you have in the Jerusalem hills, you're not normally growing crops there. It's too hard. And, plowing is not going to be forbidden in such rough, rocky soil there, because it's such hard terrain that you're not going to suspect him of getting the ground ready to do a planting and a harvest there. It's clear that you're taking out some roots that you planted there for some red dye. Now the Gemara is going to explain the term tzilos, and it says a rocky area. And by the way, sela is rock. So over here you have a switching of two of the letters to get tzilos. Anyway, Bet Shammai is saying that the matter, if this red dye root is growing in rocky terrain and not in fertile land, you can use this metal tool to get it out, because rocky terrain is not normally cultivated, and there's not really a fear that using such a tool will appear like you're working the ground, because you never would plant in that kind of ground anyway. So you have a different leniency regarding matter, regarding in rocky terrain. And the Gemara says that a brisa was taught concerning it, that in a place where people follow the custom to plow up matter growing in rocky terrain, one may plow it to weed it out, and one may weed it out. So since the rocky terrain is there, and you're not normally planting crops there, you're not worried about plowing it there, because you're not really growing a commercial food crop, and you're not really going to suspect them of plowing a rocky field to do this. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, from when is a person allowed to buy loof? In the year following Sheviis. That's what the Mishnah is talking about. In other words, you have the 8th year it came, and the question is going to be, can you purchase loof from anyone, even a person who's going to be, a possible Sheviis merchant? And, can you purchase from anybody without worrying that maybe he's selling, Sheviis produce? So when is the time that you can start purchasing crops in general? So the Gemara is going to look at Rabbi Yehuda's position, and the Gemara says, what is Rabbi Yehuda's reason? Where basically he's saying that Rabbi Yehuda is permitting purchasing of loof immediately at the end of the Sheviis year. In other words, right when the 8th year starts. And basically, Rabbi Yehuda's differentiating between other vegetables and loof, and the idea is that that you're allowed to purchase vegetables of the year following Sheviis only when vegetables of the same kind are already in production, and there's no disagreement about Rabbi Yehuda disagreeing with that. In other words, you have carrots, right? Maybe the carrots are 7th year produce, and maybe the carrots are 8th year produce. Well, on other vegetables like carrots, you can have a case where, if there's no other carrots in the store and they're not growing it in the field yet, and it's the 8th year just started, and now you're buying these carrots, and the normal fields aren't producing them yet, well, that's probably Sheviis produce. So you can't buy it. And so what they're saying is, they're saying, once you're seeing it come out of the field and go to the stores to be sold, then, probably the majority of the carrots that are coming in now are going to be 8th year produce, and it's probably not going to be 7th year produce. So you kind of don't need to worry anymore. And if a guy is doing Sheviis, Sheviis produce with carrots, probably the younger carrots are going to be better anyway, and probably going to, be, but anyway, the newer carrots are in the field, and the chances are you're buying from the newer carrots, not these older carrots. But loof is going to be different, and the Gemara is going to say that the sages decreed concerning loof that it may be uprooted in Sheviis only in an altered manner. In other words, that perhaps it grew in the 6th year, and now you're going to be harvesting it in the 7th year. And so over there, we have this Mishnah dispute between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, and Bet Shammai is saying that loof can be uprooted only with spades of wood, which is a deviation from the normal method. And Bet Hillel says you can use any metal tool, but Bet Hillel, who lets you use a metal tool, is going to do a metal mattock, which is going to be a type of like a pickaxe, and not going to be a normal thing like a metal spade. So a metal spade is the normal way you would do it, but if you're using this pickaxe to take out loof, it's obvious that you're not doing it in a normal way, and you've deviated that normal way. It's clear that you're not plowing the ground. Okay, so the idea is that the sages are saying regarding loof that it may be uprooted in the 7th only in an altered way, and therefore we can assume that any loof being offered for sale right after Sheviis is from the 6th year, because the seller would not go through the bother of uprooting loof in an altered way to go sell it. So the idea here, it says the Tiferes Yisrael, is that even dishonest Sheviis merchants are afraid to violate Sheviis openly because they can be caught and punished. And so in harvesting, they'll, where they have to do it in open, even sinners will have to use an altered way to harvest the loof. And the Gemara is saying that they would not go through this trouble just to, be able to sell it. And so it's assumed that, any loof that they're selling is going to be from the 6th year, as they claim. So the Gemara says, but the sages did not decree anything on other vegetables that it may be uprooted in an altered matter. In other words, we're worried that those Sheviis vegetables might have Sheviis produce. So the Gemara is going to continue and it's going to challenge it. It's going to say, if so, then even during Sheviis, it should be allowed to purchase loof from this person. In other words, the fact that he would not bother to uproot the loof in an unusual manner should tell us that what he's selling during Sheviis is going to be from the 6th year. So then why is it allowed to purchase loof from him immediately after Sheviis, but not during Sheviis itself? And the Gemara is going to answer. It's going to say, regarding loof that's being offered for sale in the 8th year, we're dealing with buried loof. In other words, loof that was picked some time ago. In other words, what this is saying is whether the loof is picked in the 6th year, as the seller claims, or in the 7th year, it definitely was not picked recently. Rather, it was picked a long time ago and preserved through burial, and now it's being removed from this holding area in order to sell it. So the Gemara is going to continue, and it's going to say, so that he should not go and bring from prohibited produce, in other words, produce that actually did get picked during Sheviis, and say, I brought this from that which was buried in the 6th year. In other words, perhaps this was, buried in the 6th year for storage, and then taken out in the 8th year. And so that the idea is that, the rabbis are basically saying that even if loof is purchased in the 8th year, we're worried that the seller may have picked it in the 7th year, and therefore they're forbidding purchasing loof after the Sheviis until a new crop of loof is already being marketed. And so if they're saying like, oh, this was really 6th year loof that was buried, well, you can't tell the difference between that or between just regular 7th year loof that was not buried, but it was actually growing in the ground. He just harvested it, and now he's selling it at the start of the 8th year. And so that's a case where one would not be Sheviis merchandise, and the other one definitely is Sheviis merchandise. So it opens up the door for people to cheat, because you can't figure out if this loof was really stored in the 6th year, or if it was picked in the 7th year and it's Sheviis. It's got Sheviis sanctity to it. And so that, in this argument, the sages are basically saying, no, you got to wait till this new crop comes in. That way you can be sure that this is definitely not Sheviis produce, and because you can't rely on this guy who's just selling this new loof right in the 8th year before it's in the field, and say, like, you can't rely on him that, this is really in a burial patch from year 6 and being in storage. Maybe it's going to be Sheviis produce. So Rabbi Yehuda supports this ruling and says it was taught in a brisa that Rabbi Yehuda says an incident occurred in which we were in Ein Kushin and we ate loof by instruction of Rabbi Tarfon, and immediately following the festival of Sukkot of a year after Sheviis. And so we can see that Rabbi Tarfon, who lives a generation before us, is allowing loof to be purchased immediately after Sheviis. In other words, right after the 8th year happens. And in other words, Sukkot is a time considered immediately after Sheviis, because that's going to be too early to have new loof crop. And Rabbi Yosef says to him, it's going to be Rabbi Tarfon, the incident is not as you describe it. I was with you, and it occurred only following Pesach. In other words, what he's saying is that your memory is not right on this. And when we went to Rabbi Tarfon was not serving us loof from right after Sukkot, before the loof starts coming out into the field. We're talking about the time after Pesach, where definitely there's a new loof crop already being sold in the market, because loof is one of the things that we put onto the platter for Pesach, and it's clear that this rabbi forgot this earlier time, which it was, but this does support the ruling that even Rabbi Tarfon is not allowing that you buy right away this eighth year, right as the eighth year starts, this loof crop before it enters the field, that you got to wait until it enters the field, and that you can see basically that Rabbi Tarfon is following what the sages are saying. Anyway, have a great day.